We all agree that the state of our economy is foundational to our way of life as Canadians. So today, we're going to talk about the economy in 2025. Well, today I'm excited as we talk about the state of our economy to welcome our friend Matt Lau. Matt is an accomplished writer. You can often see his work in many publications, including the Financial Post. His specialty is, of course, finances and economics. So, a warm welcome to you, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Matt, it's great to see you because we know that the whole issue of the economy is very complex in this country. We've got obviously different government actors and the complexity of the private sector. We also have all kinds of issues related to the economy internationally. So I do want to get a kind of a basic reading from you in terms of, well, really what is the state of the economy? We know it's so critical. Um, one of the things that fascinated me is that you did I thought, a brilliant article the other year with the C2C Journal, and you talked about some key facts that frame up the state of the economy. And one of the things I liked about your article is it was very factual based. And I guess my question is, there seems to be a lot of noise, Matt, when it comes to discussions around the state of the economy. Would you say that there's some pretty baseline facts that cut through all that noise?
Well, there's a lot of noise because there's always a lot of stories around the economy, right? The economy impacts our daily lives, and that's going to generate a lot of stories. It also generates a lot of headlines because things in the economy are changing so quickly, especially with a lot
Mhm.
of economic policy, for example, that's coming from the United States, which seems to change every day. So there's a lot of headlines and a lot of noise, but underneath a lot of the headlines and the noise, you can look at numbers to try to get a picture of how the economy is going. And if you look at the numbers underlying the economy in Canada, I don't think it paints a very rosy picture right now. Whether you look at, GDP growth or employment or, government debt, a lot of these things are trending in the wrong direction for Canada in recent years. So hopefully those are the things that we can
Mm.
get into.
Okay, so just to summarize, if we use the analogy of, well, a patient, um, the Canadian economy, are we trending up, sideways, or down?
Well, it depends on what time period you look at, right? But if you look at just the most recent quarters, real GDP per capita seems to have declined in most of the recent quarters, going back the last few years. And if you look at the forward-looking trend, we're probably going to, according to most forecasts, have a pretty soft 2025 and maybe even 2026.
Okay. So we're not exactly a robust economy. We're hanging in there, but we've got a lot of work to do. Is that another way to summarize it?
Absolutely. I think, one of the things that we have almost a consensus on across, everyone in across different industries from different political stripes have pretty much agreed that we have a bit of a productivity crisis in Canada, or actually a lot of a productivity crisis in Canada.
Mhm.
Our economy just hasn't been getting more productive or growing very quickly over, call it, the past 10 years. The Bank of Canada said, I think it was a year ago, that it's we're almost in a place where you have to smash the glass and call it an
Mhm.
emergency. That's how bad our economic productivity has gotten in recent years.
And when you say productivity, do you mean in the sense that the level of productivity of our economy, and why is that important?
Well, productivity is really, at least in terms of material consumption, what really drives our standard of living. Because in order for us in the long run to be able to consume things, whether it's, housing or healthcare or electronics or, automobiles, household appliances, whatever the case may
Mhm.
be, in order to consume things, we have to produce them first or produce things that we can trade to get the things that we want to consume. So if we're having a lot of trouble producing things, goods and services, then we're going to have a declining standard of living. So that's really the problem
Mhm.
that the Canadian economy is facing is we're not being, the economy is not productive enough, and our standards of living have stagnated as a result.
Okay, so there you have it. The economy matters. So we're going to dare to go through this fairly quickly, a number of these slides, and talk about some related issues. But the economy matters to every Canadian. So the first one is an interesting slide. It talks about the so called cumulative real GDP growth per capita. So what does this mean in lay language, Matt?
Yeah, so this is really just since the third quarter of 2015, how much has our economy grown after you adjust for inflation and population? And what this is saying is, by mid 2023, in the United States, there's been over 12% growth, and in Canada, it's less than 2%. And in fact, if you extend this graph out to the end of 2024, the US is
Hmm.
more like 18% versus still around 2% in Canada. So in terms of
Hmm.
how productive is the economy per person after you adjust for inflation? Another way of thinking about this is, if our economy had kept track with the United States over the past decade, on average, incomes our gross productivity would be about 16% higher than it actually is today. So obviously, this is a huge gap, and our economy has, at least in relative terms, fallen quite far behind.
Okay, Matt. So it sounds like we're on a path of two different countries where the United States is growing, and quite frankly, our economy is stagnant. So that means what for Canadians? Does it mean that we have much lower incomes than Americans?
Well, it does mean our incomes are on average much lower than Americans, but it also means that we're falling much further behind. And actually, if you start breaking out the different parts of GDP, the one that I always look at is business investment, because business investment in capital, capital investment, in machineries and equipment and structures, that is what actually makes workers more productive and what
Mhm.
grows the economy faster. So if you look at the last decade through to the end of 2024, um, real business investment per capita in Canada is actually down about 8%, while it's up something like 32% in the United States. The C.D. Howe Institute did a study
Wow.
on this recently, and they found that the investment gap between Canada and the US from the late 1990s to call it the
Mhm.
early 2010s had narrowed. But since then, since maybe 2015, it's widened quite significantly so that by
Mhm.
2024, Canadians received only about 66 cents of new capital for every dollar received by their counterparts in other developed countries, and only 55 cents for every dollar of new capital investment received by US workers. So our economy is falling behind, our productivity is falling behind, and the main metric that I look at, which is investment, because that's what drives future productivity, that's falling behind
Exactly.
even more. So that is very concerning
So
for our economy.
okay, so this is a huge red flag for Canadians in the sense that businesses have a kind of a rate of investment, like they buy or build better factories, they buy better equipment, they invest in the business so they can produce better quality, better stuff, so to speak. And we're not doing that. We're really falling behind when it comes to other leading countries. So that explains part of it in terms of why our economy is stagnant, but our standard of living is also stagnant. Is that what you're getting at, Matt?
That's absolutely true because when we don't invest in machinery and equipment and intellectual property and all the other stuff, then our workers won't be as productive. And when our
Mhm.
workers aren't productive, then wages fall behind and the economy becomes stagnant and our standards of living become stagnant as well.
Okay, so this is a big story that's often probably below the radar of most people. Why would you ever know this? So, but this is critical to Canadians because it really forms the foundation not only of our future employment prospects, but our standard of living and even our well, everything, like whether we have a health care, whether we have good education, a standard of living that enables us to move forward. It's huge, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think just to pick up on something you said, I think a lot of people are noticing it. They do notice that, or at least a lot of people notice that they're struggling to, make ends meet. The cost of housing is going up. The cost of a lot of other goods is going up, perhaps faster than their wages are. If you look at, for example, food bank use or homelessness,
Hmm.
there's a lot of numbers that are trending in the wrong direction, and I think a lot of people are really feeling the pinch to their wallets. If you ask people over the last few years, do you think the economy has performed well? Do you think that the economy is becoming more productive? Do you think you're able to consume more and higher quality goods and services than you were 3, 4, 5 years ago? I think a lot of people would say no, and that's what we see in the numbers.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Well, we've got a second slide. It has to do with so called program spending, and there's billions of dollars here. What do we mean by this graph here? It says program spending.
Well, program spending, so this is a chart of how much money the federal government spends in each year, excluding on interest payments. So that's what program spending is. It's all of the government spending excluding on servicing the debt, because servicing the debt is, a mandatory, you can't default on your debt, but everything else we call program spending because that's really what the government has to control, right? That's what government can
Hmm.
ramp up or down. And what we see here is not only that is program spending increasing every year, but every time the government makes a new spending update, you see the line is higher than before. And that's
Hmm.
because not only spending going up every year, but every year they revise their future spending projections upwards. So, again, the C.D. Howe Institute has done a lot of good work on this. And what they said is, if you look at the most recent spending update, which is the fall 2024 uh,
Hmm.
fiscal update, um, there was a $48 billion deficit in that fiscal update. But if they just stuck to their spending track that they had set out a few years ago, if you look at budget 2021, how much is the federal government going to spend in 2024 and 25? If they had actually
Hmm.
stuck to their numbers from a few years ago, instead of having a $48 billion deficit, we would have had a $42 billion surplus. And the
Oh, my.
2021 budget was not any measure of austerity. It was still a big spending budget. And
Hmm.
I think what that illustrates is just how much bigger the budget has gotten every year, right? From going from a 48 billion or sorry, $42 billion surplus if we stuck to the spending plan of just a few years ago, instead we have a $48 billion deficit, right? We basically ramped up spending by approximately $90 billion. I think it's a very irresponsible way to manage a budget and manage an economy.
Wow. And that's just the federal government, which keeps going, ramping up spending year after year. We're not even talking about the other levels of government, namely, well, the provincial governments are also, depending on which one you're looking at, big challenges. Like the province of Ontario, as an example, is just tabling another massive deficit when they were, in fact, just the other year projecting was it a modest surplus?
Yes, I mean, every time, I mean, if you look at the Ontario projections, they're not quite as egregious as you see for the federal government, but you see a very similar story, which is that the timeline for balancing the budget just keeps getting
Hmm.
pushed out. And every time that they come out with a new spending estimate, it just keeps going higher than the one that they said before.
Hmm.
The thing I keep pointing to is if you just rewind to when, so for example, in Ontario, we have a progressive conservative government led by Doug Ford. And if you rewind to when he was in opposition, of course, he criticized the previous liberal government for spending too much money. If you look at how much money he's spending, even adjusting for the size of the growth of the economy, he's spending more as a percentage of GDP than the liberal government that he replaced and that he criticized for wasting many billions of dollars. In fact, if he kept the spending ratio constant, spending to GDP constant versus
Hmm.
what he had inherited, Ontario taxpayers would be saving about $10 billion this year. So I
It's
think,
incredible. Yeah.
yeah, so whether it's the
So the
federal
story
government or the
is
Ontario
is
government, or many other governments, the spending projections just keep going up and the timeline for balancing the budget just keeps getting pushed back.
So it's the theme is spend, spend, spend. So is there any provincial government that is doing a pretty good job managing its finances? Is Saskatchewan a candidate for that award?
Well, there are, I haven't looked at all of the provinces, but um, they seem to go up and down. So a lot of provinces were, for example, projecting, and in Ontario included, to be fair, were projecting much healthier finances before this latest tariff madness got brought to light and started,
Mhm.
having a lot of negative impact on economic projections. So one of the things that does, make it harder to balance a budget is when your economy is slow, and EI spending, for example, has to get pushed up because people get out of, lose their jobs. You may have to spend a little bit more on social assistance, and your revenue is going to go down because if the economy's slow, you're going to take in less tax revenue. So some of the provinces, in terms of, um, you know, the red ink that we're seeing in provincial budgets, can kind of be blamed on that. But I think if you look at, I bring up Ontario and the federal government again. I mean, the finance were already in pretty bad shape before any of the recent, negative developments came to light. I don't think you can really point to that too much as an excuse.
Okay. So we have another slide. It's called net federal debt. Speaking of debt, and this is, of course, in billions of dollars. And so this slide looks kind of red to me. Matt, can you help us explain? This is at the federal level, again, alone. What does this mean?
Yeah, so this is the net federal debt, and the story is very much the same as spending and the deficits, which is not only does that number climb every year, but every time that they put out a new projection, it's worse than the one before it. Um, and again, if you extend that line out and include the latest figures, I think at the end of the 2024-25 fiscal year, we've crossed the $1.4 billion or $1.4 trillion threshold. And of course, that line is just going to keep going up. Um, if you look at the fall economic statement from 2024, the balanced budget was not in sight. If you look at the
Mhm.
latest campaign platform that Mark Carney got reelected on, the numbers are even worse. I believe it was adding something like, I will have to recall my figures, but I think it was something like $130 billion, or sorry, nearly $230 billion increase in federal debt over the next 4 years. That was what the new Liberal platform had called for. Higher spending than in the fall economic statement and higher debt. So it seems to be a pattern.
Well, so to be kind of the devil's advocate, do debts really matter, Matt? Because I mean, I look at this and say, well, we have in a personal situation, we may have a mortgage, and you'd say, well, you need to watch your finances, you need to meet your budget, you can't have too big a debt. What is that analogous or fair to governments? Because I look at this and I say, well, there's people out there. I think there was some French economists or theorists that came up with the so-called notion of modern monetary theory, where it's almost like deficits and debts don't matter. So, what's your take on this, Matt? Are we being a little bit too prudish here and conservative when it comes to the need to balance our budgets?
Well, when you think about borrowing money and whether it's wise or not, it really depends on what the money is for and can you afford to pay it back. So when you bring up the example of a mortgage, I think, um, you know, generally Canadians are borrowing wisely because you bring that debt onto the balance sheet, but you're also bringing on an asset, which is the house. And when people take on a mortgage, the banks underwrite it in such a way that they're pretty confident that they're going to get their money back, that the people are going to be able to afford to make payments on that mortgage.
Hmm.
And over time, the mortgage balance actually does shrink because people are paying down the debt. If you look at what the federal government has borrowed for, and the reason for these deficits. It's because the government is consuming a lot of money. It's not buying assets. It's not building infrastructure. It's consuming,
Mm-hmm.
and the debt burden keeps going up. It's not going down. So that's very opposite to your mortgage example.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at what governments are spending money on and borrowing all that money for, I don't think it's accurate to say that we're getting much in return. If you look at, for example, healthcare wait times, if you look at the state of this is a more provincial issue, but if you look at the state of the education system, is that getting better or worse? Is
Mm-hmm.
our national defense getting better or worse? Um, if you try to examine what government is giving back to Canadians, whether it's the federal
Mm-hmm.
government or provincial or local governments, in exchange for all these taxes we're paying and all of this money that's being borrowed. I don't think you can conclude that we're getting a very good deal.
Okay, so does that beg the fundamental question? And then I know that at Frontier we've got a long history of saying, well, you need to have the right balance of the size of government, and you need to ensure that government has a focus and does the basics well. So there's a ton of things that our government does that, quite frankly, the private sector could do better. Why don't we just privatize all those things?
Well, I think you're right that the private sector tends to do a lot of things better than the federal government. Um, for example, we have these recent stories about Canada Post, which is effectively bankrupt and may start imposing a pretty significant burden on taxpayers if it starts losing money.
Mhm,
Um, Canada Post is in a very bad financial situation, and I think it's lost money in either the last 6 years or six of the last seven or something like that. And that
mhm.
is
That's
despite
right.
having a monopoly in certain areas in which it operates in. So, Canadians are
Mhm,
really um, being hit by Canada Post in a few different ways. First of all, they're inefficient and losing money, so taxpayers may be called on to support Canada Post. Secondly, they're
mhm,
gouging consumers in areas where they have a monopoly with prices that are too high. And
mhm,
then thirdly, um, the third thing that's in the news about Canada Post is they might be going on strike yet again. So we have bad service. We might, cost the taxpayers, and prices are too high. Um, there have been studies done on this trying to compare Canada Post to
mhm,
competitors, private competitors, and the preponderance of evidence would suggest that just the way that Canada Post does things is horribly inefficient. And
mhm,
I think it's no surprise. I don't think, um, if you ask any person on the street, do you think the private sector operates more efficiently or the government? I don't think anybody would come on the side of the government to say that the
mhm.
government does things in a more cost-effective manner than the private sector.
No, exactly. So, it sounds like we've got some structural problems with our economy. And so there's an opportunity to do better. Privatization is one example. And the benefit of privatization would be not only could you get better service potentially, but you could also have those organizations paying taxes. And I think it has a big impact then on our culture as well. So here's another slide. It's called Consumer Price Index. This sounds like the price of what it costs to purchase things, and it's interesting. We know that we just heard that the inflation rate has come down a little bit as they took away the carbon tax, and we'll get to that in a sec. But what is this graph all about?
Well, what this graph shows is if the rate of inflation had fall of consumer goods and services had followed what it had been since about what it was the past decade before 2021 and inflation started spiking. If it had just followed that previous trend, the price level would be about 9% lower than what it actually is. So you
Oh,
had mentioned that, for example, the latest inflation report, I forget the exact number, it was maybe 1.6 or 1.8%, but that's just the year
mhm,
over year increase from uh, April 2024 to April 2025. The rate of increase of prices has fallen down to 1.6 or 1.8%. That doesn't
mhm,
undo all of the very significant increases that have taken place in 2021 and 2022 and 23.
mhm,
The price level is still 9 or 10% higher than what it
Hmm.
would have been if inflation had just followed the previous trend. So,
Hmm.
you know, inflation has been one of the big topics over the last few years because it is the main measure of the cost of living and how affordable it is, whether it's to buy groceries or gas or anything else. So
Hmm.
when things are
Well,
9 or 10% more expensive than they could have been, that's a big deal.
mhm. Well, and it's really impacting people's lives. I mean, I just marvel at the grocery store. I bump into all these people, and they have real frustration about the cost of just trying to survive. And then you've got an increase in things that you can't really avoid. For example, like property taxes as an example, or other forms of taxation. So the carbon tax was noticeable. Like, it really made a difference in the price of gas. But what's going to be the future of that carbon tax? Because that really represented a big price impact on people's lives.
Yeah, and it was not only just in the price of gas, it was in the price really of many goods because many goods um, have some kind of uh, carbon footprint, right? Like anything that needs to be transported, the transportation sector has a pretty significant carbon footprint. So the carbon tax really inflated the costs of many goods, not just of gas. As to
Uh-huh.
the future of the
Uh-huh.
carbon tax, I mean, it seems to have been sufficiently unpopular that the government is going to stray away from it um, if it knows what's good for them. But the problem
Mhm.
is, one of the reasons that the carbon tax was unpopular is because it was very visible, for example, at the gas pump,
Mm.
where people paid for it very expensively. I worry that the government, because it still has this environmental agenda where it wants to reduce greenhouse gases very aggressively, that the
Mhm.
way it's going to go about things now, instead of having a tax, is through regulations or through other policies that are more expensive, but in which the cost of the policy is more hidden from the consumer than
Mm.
when it is in the case of a carbon tax.
Mhm.
So,
So it'll
for
just be kind of hidden
example,
behind, with the like, at the industrial level rather than the consumer level.
well, it's hidden at the prime minister did say that he wants to keep the industrial carbon tax. He's also um, you know uh, said he'd keep a lot of other policies. Um, there was the Bill C-69, right, which is the
Mhm.
environmental assessment review that has basically blocked a lot of pipeline activity in
Mhm.
Canada. There's uh, the ban on conventionally powered cars, basically an
Mhm.
electric vehicle mandate that's going to be phased in by 2035. Um, and we'll see what else comes down the pipeline from this government. But because they're so committed to reducing carbon emissions, um, I'm sure they're going to be proposing a lot of other policies. Even if they don't bring the tax back, they're going to be bringing in a lot of other expensive policies if they want to achieve their environmental goals, and those are going
Mhm.
to show up in the prices of consumer goods eventually.
Okay, so stay tuned on that one as we see a new government in place here. The next slide is the cumulative real GDP growth per capita, and this is from an organization who did an outlook for 2020 all the way to 2060. And that little red line there, is that us, Matt, in Canada?
Yeah, so this was a few years ago. A The OECD outlook projected real GDP growth per capita for the next 40 years. And relative to all the other developed economies of the world, Canada comes in last. Now, there's various reasons why that might be, and I don't know exactly what assumptions went into that outlook. But if you look at the current trend, it's very believable, just based on how the economy has
Mhm.
performed in the last few years or even the past decade. Canada has very, uh, you know, badly performed relative to other economies. We've
Hmm.
also,
Hmm.
as I mentioned previously, performed very badly with regards to business investment, which is in many ways, a predictor of how fast your economy is going to grow in the future. If you look at the types of economic policies that we have coming down the pipeline, um, we see, as we've talked about earlier, again, more government debt, more spending, probably more environmental regulation coming down the pipeline.
Hmm.
So all of these things are, again, a drag on economic growth. So if this projection was from a few years ago, but if you were to update it for today, I don't think you would get something very much better. I think the outlook
Hmm.
for the Canadian economy, unless there's a very big change in terms of policy, in the next few years, I think the outlook is pretty miserable because it's been miserable for
Hmm.
the last decade and not much has changed at the policy level. Why would it be any better for the next decade or the decade after that?
Exactly. Yeah, so this is very concerning. And, none of us have a crystal ball, but clearly a lot of work goes into these analyses. I did look at the executive summary for this particular report. And, the variables are all highly logical within their model, and who knows whether it'll pan out to be true. But I think what you're saying is that if we're going to continue on the current path, yeah, this is where we would end up as dead last within OECD countries. So not a good graph. The next one is called the cumulative real business growth per labor force member. So what does this mean, Matt?
Well, this is very similar to what we talked about before, right? This is how much business investment is available to Canadian workers. And the answer is, well, if you look at the way it's been trending over the last 8 to 10 years, we actually are investing less in our workers than we used to be. And I think this
Hmm.
is what, the numbers that a lot of people have talked about in the last year about Canada's economy slowing down. We don't have much business confidence. Businesses don't want to invest in this country anymore. We see a lot of capital flight. So, people taking their capital out of Canada and investing it elsewhere in the United States, perhaps.
Okay, so
Canada
so
just
does this so this kind of helps reflect why the prediction with the previous slide is so low is because they're looking at all this kind of business investment and saying the money is flowing downhill like water and it's going to other countries. It's leaving Canada. Is that the bottom line here?
That is exactly right, right? When we don't have investment in the economy, then wages are going to fall because our workers are less productive and our economy is going to
Hmm.
stagnate. And that's what we had seen in the previous chart, which is that relative to other countries, our outlook is for the economy is very stagnant. If you don't
Hmm.
invest in the country, you're not going to become more productive and it's not going to grow.
Exactly. Gosh, this sounds like a depressing story, these graphs, and I don't mean to get our you and our audience down here, Matt, but I mean, this is empowering because we gotta know what the facts are and the situation, but our economy looks pretty grim. I mean, if we look at this as the analogy of a patient, I mean, I think we're going down. We're not even holding our own, are we, Matt?
The economy is definitely going in the wrong direction now. If you want um, to try to have some more hopeful stuff instead of the grim stuff we've just talked about, the hopeful part is that, our economy has been in worse situations in the past. If you look
Mm.
in the 1990s, Canada was actually in a debt crisis where it was getting to the point where, federal and provincial governments were having trouble borrowing money. The Wall Street Journal, I think it was in 1994 or 95, had a very influential editorial called Bankrupt Canada. And it
That's
essentially
right.
called Canada a third world country with respect to our debt problem. So we're not,
Mhm.
we've been in worse places before. And the good news, if you want a break from all the grim stuff, the good news is that if you have the right direction and you can
Mhm.
turn things around pretty quickly, but it does tend to have a lot of pain involved. When the patient is going downhill, sometimes it takes a lot of very shocking or bitter or very strong medicine to get the patient going in the right direction again.
So there you heard it from Dr. Lau. We need an intervention. We need some strong medicine. So we need to get back to the basics, to use those phrases. And we've heard about this before. So help us understand the solutions. Where are the rays of hope here in terms of turning the ship around? I know certainly you were a close observer as well in terms of what former prime ministers like Jean Chrétien and the Minister of Finance Paul Martin did, and among others. So there is hope here. So what are the top things that we need to do to turn this ship around?
Well, in terms of turning the economy around, there's a general economic principle that I quite like, and it's one of my favorite sayings from Milton Friedman, who's my favorite economist, who said that
Hmm.
nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. If we have an economy in which the government does a lot of spending, it's people who are spending other people's money, they're not going to do it very carefully. They're going to waste a lot of money. And the way that we turned the economy around in the 1990s, as you mentioned under Chrétien and Martin, was to reduce
Hmm.
government spending. And it's important to note that in the 1990s, it wasn't just the federal government, the Liberal government under Chrétien and Martin that did that, but there was a conservative government in Alberta that very aggressively cut spending. Even the
Hmm.
NDP government in Saskatchewan very aggressively cut spending. Some other
Yeah.
provinces, like the Conservatives in Ontario in the 1990s, had some significant spending reforms as well. And really, the main point of getting government spending down and more focused on the essentials is to waste less money, to have more money, therefore, in the hands of the private sector, so that the private sector can put it to productive use, such as investing it in machinery and equipment and capital and building factories or doing R&D, and that's what makes the
Hmm.
economy more productive. It's not government spending, it's business
Hmm.
investment that makes the economy more productive. And when the government spend less, you leave more hands in the private sector, and that is where you're going to have more economic productivity and growth.
Right on. So that's kind of a basic prescription. I know at Frontier we've certainly released a whole series of policy principles and initiatives that would guide a better economy, and we encourage people to look at that website. We need to slash the red tape. In fact, when I look at the state of Canada, don't you marvel, Matt, that we don't have free trade in this country? How is that possible that we can't even have free trade among the provinces? That, depending on how you calculate it, is already 4 or 5 points in the GDP. That's thousands of dollars per Canadian. Is that correct?
That's absolutely true, and there have been studies done on this, and it's something like, as you mentioned, about 4% of GDP. Now, um, this issue came up quite significantly when Donald Trump was applying tariffs and
Hmm.
reducing free trade between Canada and the United States, and a lot of people brought up, well, we don't even have free trade in our own country. And in
Hmm.
fact, the effect of the U.S. tariffs on Canada are probably less than 3 or 4% of our GDP. So our own internal trade barriers are costing more than what Trump is threatening or is going to impose on us. Um, you,
Isn't that
a
ironic?
lot
So
of
you're
different
saying
think
that
tanks.
the so-called Trump threats of tariffs was actually less an impact than our
Yeah,
own problems of lack of free trade within Canada.
yeah. So, a lot of think tanks have done a lot of work on the different interprovincial trade barriers that we have. So even, for example, the Montreal Economic Institute um,
Mhm.
has mentioned that if you look at trucking, for example, every province has its own requirements as to the load limits on the trucks and types of
Mhm.
tires on the truck and how big a truck can be. I think the McDonald Laurier Institute or another think tank had done a study
Yes.
on how much does that actually add to the cost of transportation. It was something like 8% of the cost of transporting goods between provinces is the result of
Mhm.
um, regulation and interprovincial trade barriers on the regulations on trucks, right? Like you have a lot of occupational licensing
Mhm.
differences where if you're a nurse in one province, you can't practice in another province. I think is just absolutely ridiculous.
Mhm.
Um, as you say, the interprovincial trade barriers are so costly in this country, and as I mentioned, probably more costly than even tariffs that
Mhm.
we've been threatened by Donald Trump.
Wow, we've met the enemy and it is ourselves. That's what I hear. So in this context, and we know there's a lot of things we can do to really move this country forward, like building pipelines to, Hudson's Bay to all the coastlines. I think the other thing that strikes me as a great opportunity is for us to actually be able to um, stop all these subsidies of businesses that frankly don't have a future. And I know you've written extensively on this, Matt, but the absurd situation of all the subsidies going to, well, things like electric vehicles, all kinds of other initiatives. Why do we do this, Matt? Why does some politician they can't seem to resist cutting a ribbon at a factory and being associated with creating jobs? They should just get out of the way, shouldn't they, Matt?
They should get out of the way. The reason they do it is for the reason that they do most things, which is that they think it'll help them get elected. If they cut a ribbon in a certain riding, it may get them votes in that riding, and the
Mm.
cost, which is dispersed on the rest of the country, may not be quite as noticeable because it's dispersed over
Oh.
so many taxpayers. But just to go
Mhm.
back and give some figures, for example, on your electric vehicle subsidy example, um, the federal government and the Ontario government gave combined handouts of about $28 billion for two electric vehicle battery plants in Ontario. Um,
28 billion.
Yes, this was the Stellantis, LG, and the Volkswagen handouts, which had been promised in 2023 and which are still ongoing. And at the time, the Liberal government said it's going to generate a lot of economic activity, it's going to create a lot of
Mhm.
jobs, it's going to create a lot of tax revenue because of that, and we'll get our investment back in about 3 years.
Mhm.
Now, the parliamentary budget officer did an estimate on it and said it's not 3 years, it's more like 20 years. Now, I looked at the parliamentary budget officer's assessment, and I found it to use some quite generous assumptions, but let us suppose that it is really a 20-year payback time. Um, I mean, I think we can all agree that if a project has a 20-year payback timeline, if you invest $28 billion and you get a 0% return over 20 years because you're just breaking even, I think that's uh, a, a financial catastrophe to get a 0%
Wow.
return over 20 years on $28 billion. And that's
Mhm.
just one example of corporate welfare. There are many others. Over the years, the government has put many tens of billions of dollars not only into electric vehicles,
Mhm.
but into just about every economic activity imaginable.
I like your thinking, Matt. Let's get rid of the corporate welfare. Um, so let's turn our attention to the United States here. There's a lot of things going on there. We know the United States is trying to shake up global trade to try to make it, quote, fair. They claim they want free trade, but fair trade. And so what's interesting is they're cutting deal after deal. They just announced deals with the UK, I think a framework deal with China. I mean, it's really quite astounding how they are changing things. But one of the things that's curious about their um, concerns about Canada is that Canada actually pull its fair share and weight when it comes to defense. And we know, for decades, Canada's been a NATO freeloader. But it's interesting. Are you optimistic that we will hear that message and actually come to the security table? Because my understanding is that the United States sees that as the number one issue, and then it's followed by economic trade. So, in other words, if you don't make it to the security table, you don't have a table. Sorry, you don't have a seat at the security table. So you really can't avoid this issue. Are you optimistic that we can square that circle?
Now, Canada's lack of defense spending is a very serious issue. I think, the state of our military is a bit of a shambles.
Mhm.
Our national defense is just nowhere where it should be. I do think that is a separate issue from the trade issue, though, because the way that Trump has behaved on trade doesn't have too much rhyme or reason to it. the way that he's imposed tariffs on all sorts of countries and not just Canada, um, there was no real method as to how much um, the rate of tariffs he wants to charge in each country. Even when it came to Canada, for example,
Hmm. Hmm.
it used to be, well, there's drugs at the border, and it turned out that drugs crossing the border were a very small percentage, and Canada was going to take action on it anyways. And then it became balance of trade and trade deficit. So, I don't know that anything that comes out of this current U.S. administration can really be trusted. And you
Hmm.
mentioned, they're cutting trade deals with all sorts of countries. Well, we had a trade deal with them. It was
Indeed.
negotiated when Trump was last in office, and
Hmm.
he's basically ripping it up to impose all of these new tariffs. So I don't know how much value you can place on a new deal with Trump. He might just
Hmm.
rip it up like
Hmm.
he ripped up the last one. So
Yeah.
you're right.
Well, he would say that
The
he's
U.S. has a
renegotiating it.
legitimate yeah, so you're right that the U.S. has a legitimate grievance with the defense spending, and that really is a deficiency for Canada. But I do see it as a separate issue from tariffs and trade.
Okay, so we will see how that world unfolds. So my question then becomes, when we look at um, Canada moving forward, I mean, why do these slides matter? The reality of a stagnant economy strikes me as being profoundly important when it comes to, well, the viability of a middle class in this country. I mean, we just released a report on housing affordability. And in major markets, not all, but in major markets, it looks pretty bad. It looks pretty grim. I mean, you look at the markets like Toronto and Vancouver. The next generation really doesn't have a future when it comes to buying a home. So, what's the future if they don't even have a viable job? So, how do we move this country forward then, Matt, during this time?
Yeah, I think it's what you said as to why all these numbers matter is because what's what these numbers are driving, what these numbers are illustrating is that the standard of living in Canada um, is going in the wrong direction in many respects and for many people. Um, and a lot of times things do have to get worse before they can get better.
Mm, mhm.
If we go back to the example of the 1990s, things had to get much worse before they got much better. We were in a much worse spot before. And if you look around the world, there are other countries, I mean, who have gotten much worse places as well and have managed to turn things around. Um,
Mhm.
the one notable example in the current world is Argentina, right? Where their
Yes, indeed.
economy has been in massive shambles. They've had, something approaching hyperinflation if they weren't there already, and they had a complete reversal of direction in terms of policy direction, and inflation seems now to be getting under control. The rental supply, they've taken a lot of rent control and other restrictions off, so the rental supply is recovering. The GDP is recovering there. So things are finally trending in the right direction there. Sometimes things have to get worse before it kind of shakes you into a wake-up call and into changing the direction and changing things for the better, right? Like as I mentioned in the 1990s, we were in a debt crisis before governments got serious and got their act together. Hopefully, we don't have to get in that situation again, but we shall
I
see.
think you're right. But I like your point that let's pay attention to these slides. Let's pay attention to the facts and how this economy is going. It obviously matters, and we can adjust our course. I think that's part of the lesson of history that you're pointing out, and certainly the inspiration from other countries, including Argentina, is that we can make choices. So, speaking of choices, we know we have a new prime minister, largely a similar cabinet, if you will, of people that are very familiar to us. Do you see signs of hope as well? We won't have a budget until this fall, apparently. What would you say are the opportunities for this government to start signaling to every Canadian that we're on a new pathway?
Well, I'm not very optimistic about the new government because when you looked at the platform that they put out and they got reelected on, um, the fiscal trajectory was worse than even the previous government. There was more
Mm,
spending and more debt than the previous government has promised. Now, um, there were maybe a few bright points. The cancellation of the consumer-facing carbon tax is one of them. The other big one I'll point to is the cancellation of the capital gains tax hike. And the common thread that, um, you know, kind of forced the government to turn back on those two issues was there's just a huge public backlash to those two policies. I
mm,
think it's
mhm,
generally the case that governments um, have to some very significant degree, because they want to be reelected.
mhm,
They have to respond to what the public is saying, and I think the only way that government spending is going to get under control and taxes are going to get under control and the government is going to go in the right direction again is if people start demanding it very loudly and in large enough numbers.
indeed. So the public opinion does matter, and certainly that's why this kind of discussion, I think, frankly, matters when we learn more about the economy and your insight and prescriptions to improving it. And I think what we're at now is truly our country's at a crossroads, whether we're going to continue to decline or whether we're going to move forward. And I guess one of the things that I find fascinating is the question of environmental policy and how that relates to the economy. We know that the number one strength to our economy is our oil and gas sector in this country. So, do you have the sense that this new government will continue that war on oil and gas, or will it modify course?
Well, Mark Carney has already said he will keep in place many of the worst environmental policies that Trudeau had put in place. So, um, Bill C-69, he said he's going to keep in place. He's going to keep in the phased in electric vehicle mandate. He wants to
Mhm,
keep the industrial carbon tax. Mark Carney, prior to coming back to Canada and running for prime minister, he was the UN's head of global climate finance. And what
mhm,
he, and his role there and his main purpose there was basically to try to, in a very top-down way, try to reshape the world's economies to basically decarbonize the world's economies by
mhm,
shifting large sums of private capital, whether it's through regulation or through other means, towards environmental objectives and away from fossil fuels. Ross McKittrick, who's an economist at the University of Guelph, wrote something
mhm,
shortly before the election that said, Mark Carney's our prime minister now, but effectively over the last, call it 4 to 5 years, his whole job has been to try to defund major sectors of the Canadian economy, oil
mhm.
and gas and manufacturing, by basically trying to get investment shifted out of those sectors and put elsewhere. So I'm not very optimistic about the ideology and the direction of the new government.
Mhm. Well, let's see what policy course, the new government pursues. But I think you're raising directly those questions, and I think, quite frankly, they're very relevant not only to the economic future but also the issue of national unity. Would it surprise you that so many provinces in the West are looking at how they pursue sovereignty outside of our current federation?
Yes, well, I mean, certain people within some provinces are thinking about it. I wouldn't say necessarily that any province as a whole is pursuing it, but um, I do think there are some very legitimate grievances that um, Alberta has with the federal government. All of these policies that we've talked about that are harming oil and gas
Mhm,
um, disproportionately hurt Alberta, of course. I mean, they hurt the country as a whole, but they disproportionately hurt Alberta. And I think that this government, the current federal government and the previous one under Trudeau, if you call it a different government, has been very unfair and disproportionate in the way that it's behaved. I don't think Alberta has been treated fairly, and especially Alberta's main industry, oil and gas. The
Mhm.
the um, the regulatory policies that the government has pursued are just very damaging to Alberta.
Indeed. Well, this certainly is a historic time for our country as we see a new federal government in place and we look at the larger state of the economy for our country. It's clear that we have a lot of work to do, and I really appreciate you joining us for this far reaching conversation, Matt. And thank you for all your leadership and commentary about this important area of policy.
Oh, thank you, David.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.